Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. With so much going on, certainly in the media and the markets, it's been a very interesting thing to step back and start saying, well, let's talk about the long term again. And the intent of today's webinar is to share with our community at AssetMap what's going on and how to actually have a conversation with a client who's 2, 3, 4 years from retirement. Now, this is really interesting right now. When you think about the volatility in the markets, if you've got clients that are a couple years away, we know that there's some anxiety there. I'm going to share with you a couple of things that we tend to think about, starting from where our practice kind of resides in the retirement planning and asset management space, and some things that we've learned over the years. So I'm going to show you actually how we actually do some of these things in AssetMap. So they're great tricks for conversations to have in general. We're tending to run a little bit long, and probably we'll go 30 minutes on content. We'll save Q&A for the end, as Allison said. Please be sure to use that panel on the right to include your questions throughout the program so we don't lose them. We'll address as many as we can towards the end. So, the reality is that when I was thinking about putting this together, clearly retirement, especially for those people a couple of years from that retirement moment or financial independence, depending upon the level of wealth you're dealing with, is clearly an elephant in the room. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how we tend to manage AssetMap inventory coming into retirement, how we communicate that progress through target maps and try to get that to 2 pages in a presentation layer. And if we have time, I'll show you how we use the financial fire drills, which is embedded in AssetMap. It's a great add-on, but you could use it on the fly. It's a great thing to send out today to clients to keep their perspective real with respect to everything that's going on short term. And of course, the beneficiary reports, making sure we have things buttoned up if, God forbid, the wrong things happen. And then we'll do this Q&A, as Allison said. So when we talk about the elephant in the room, clearly from the data that we're seeing in AssetMap, over 1 million people in AssetMap now that are working with financial professionals, clearly undersaved based upon the data. In fact, given the amount of assets that our advisors are managing, in general, they're managing only about 12% of the total asset base. But with that and the knowledge of assets out there in our clients' repertoire, as well as guaranteed income sources, right? The lack of pensions, the lack of annuity income that's already established for many reasons in the marketplace, as well as awareness. Americans are clearly undersaved for retirement. So the interesting thing is this conversational argument from a client that between the company's retirement plan, maybe my IRAs and some government pensions, they should be enough. And we all know, if we've been in the business for any length of time, they're clearly not enough. And that's why we have to force save. Living off the interest is, I think, effectively, legitimately dead. I think clients realize that this is not an option so much anymore, especially with interest rates being as low as they are and continuing to fall. We thought after about 10 years of this, we'd start seeing this increase in interest rates, but just it does not look like we're going to bank on this at all. And so you take this and you take the advent of long-term care scenarios that force us to write a bigger check in healthcare costs looming and retirement, then we really, we've got some big elephants in this room, right? So one of the things that I've been really focusing and trying to refocus a lot of advisors and our clients on is the reality is that what you pack for this eventual trip, which I call retirement or independence, really matters. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the AssetMap is to get a buy-in on intentionally what somebody has in their repertoire. And I drew this cartoon because we have seen a big difference in terms of the anxiety associated with our retirees that are in retirement when they have a single bucket of money, for example, their IRAs or their 401ks, these qualified accounts that have great tax benefits on the front end, but have questionable tax benefits on the back end, especially if we're forced to take out significant distributions in order to meet living expenses, or if tax rates do go up in the future, which is this is a real risk given the deficits that we currently have and the debt we have as a country. And so the question is that when you head into retirement, you want to have a diversity, not just of a portfolio of investments and savings and so forth. You actually want to have structural elements in your portfolio, including guaranteed income sources and pensions and tax-free assets like Roths or cash value in insurance policies. You want these options. And the real reason is because you need to have choice. Now, one of the things that I tend to look at when we consider retirement preparedness is I look for first choicefulness in the options. tax tends to drive this the most. And if you're dealing with high net worth clients, you want to see multiple buckets from which to get money. And I'll show you this actually in the asset map for what I'm tending to look for. But number one, I'm tending to look for this. Do you have choices from which to take money from? This, regardless of what the tax environment is, your health situation is, the timing of where that money could or should come from an investment liquidation standpoint, do I have choicefulness? Because it will really affect our ability to make better choices when we arrive. Okay. Best analogy I've heard is that, if your retirement is planning to be in Cancun, clearly you're going to pack shorts. But if we all know, things change over time. If I want to take a trip out to the mountains, I can't only have shorts in my backpack, right? I've got to have other options. And so the key is having different tools. The second thing we're talking about all the time is, where are we going to get income from? And so if you're looking at a business owner who's got a significant amount of capital tied up in a business, or real estate portfolios that may or may not have income generation, or actually investments, maybe even bond funds, whatever it might be, where is the income coming from? Because I need to give you certainty of spending. I'm also looking for investment flexibility. In other words, how can I invest in different types of vehicles as they become more interesting or popular, right? Is real estate going to be a better place? Is high yield investing? Am I going to want private securities? This is not, I think, always going to be a game about marketable securities, which tend to dominate our portfolios. But clearly, I need to make alternative investments. Maybe I want to make investments locally. And so do I have the flexibility and structure in my repertoire of inventory to make investments in different types of investments? Is there a significant amount of liquidity buffer, and do I have access to capital if, God forbid, I should need to write a big check? And are there ways to invest in certain types of vehicles, either those with derivatives or with guarantees tied to them, that give me double duty, right? Are there assets that give me certain estate protections or transferability at death that would be an argument for using a different vehicle, because I can get both, let's say, tax benefits as well as estate benefits from that? So we tend to look for this because, right, everything's scarce. What kind of asset protection are we having going to this? Does it matter to the household? Do I need to think about protecting not only myself, maybe my family, maybe my kids from next generation events like liability or divorces? Do I need to think about that in the structure of how I set up retirement coming into it in the next couple of years, because this is the time to do it? How am I going to deal with healthcare funding? Because this tends to be the knockout thing. So let's talk about a couple of these pieces right in AssetMap, and I'll show you how we do this. And of course, last is really the estate. Do I need to think about the estate ultimately and what we plan to buy? Now, you might be saying, well, Adam, I get this idea, right? So this is kind of the checklist that I go through mentally or physically. But I'm going to show you why it's important to talk about this in AssetMap. And most of the meetings that we tend to have pre-retirement never go into the actual planning scenarios. In other words, cash flow analysis. They tend to talk about what's the intentionality of the asset map. And so I brought up an asset map, which hopefully you can see, just to give you a story. This is Tim and Christine Jenkins. I grabbed this because obviously they're not just before retirement, but they've got a couple of things going on that I really wanted to point out, right? These guys are in their late 40s. They've amassed some level of wealth. They have some good income. So I'll point out some of the things that you want to see here. These from an income certainty standpoint, I'll start here. You can see there's a couple pieces going on here. We've got some income sources on Tim's side that we know are going to turn into cash flow. Christine has a couple different pieces. She's got an optional guaranteed income benefit from an annuity that she can trigger in her later ages. She also has a pension and she has Social Security. So government pensions here are pretty strong. We're looking already at a significant amount of their core expenses probably going to be covered from income sources. But if you also look at this, you'll also notice that they have some other interesting assets. Tim has a good amount of qualified money. Some of this money is actually inactive. In other words, he left it at an old employer, so it's underutilized in capital. Some of the questions I tend to ask someone like Tim is, what's the exit plan, right? How are we going to get this money out? How are we going to turn this into capital that we can spend? Because I have noticed over the years, and especially with the bull markets running as they have, that there's a great amount of reliance on the idea of make this account as big as possible and everything will just be fine, right? And think about that, right? If I just have a huge IRA, I can come into retirement, it'll be fine. Very few people think about how am I going to turn this into a cash flow source, right? That we kind of leave it for the future. I'm just going to grow the thing like crazy. And I think the challenge with that is that we don't acclimate our clients enough that the purpose of these qualified plans are really to turn them into income. They were intended as deferred income sources. Their tax benefit is associated with that deferral of income. They're supposed to be turned into income. In fact, a lot of people who have said I have excess qualified money that really would have been maybe a legacy or an estate asset now through the stretch, we've seen that loophole close to a degree with the Secure Act. And now that's forcing people to actually recognize that I'm supposed to spend this money. We all know the government needs the money. That means the tax money that's built into here. So one of the takeaways I want to share with you is I would really recommend that when you see qualified money, we should be asking clients, what is the exit plan? How are we planning on turning this into money that I can spend or I can't outlive in many cases if you're thinking pensions or annuities? We have to have that conversation 2-3 years out from retirement, even though you may not execute such a strategy like that, like an income strategy, because interest rates are still low, you might want to wait it out. It's important to set the stage so that when we arrive, you know that we're going to start thinking about this because we need to manage anxiety, and that's how we do it. Some of the other things I just mentioned on the prior screen, which included not the least of which choicefulness, one of the things you might notice is that this person has a significant amount of assets in lots of different types of things. So what am I talking about? Well, you see the basics. You see the qualified accounts, right, which tend to have tax deferral and maybe some tax appeal. But these people don't have any Roths, which means they don't necessarily have any tax-free options. The only asset you might see that has certain tax advantages on distribution is this cash value at the bottom here, which has some good tax benefits, but there's really not enough money in there to really warrant it. They do own a side business. You might see this. So this one might also ask, what's the exit here? This might give them some tax benefits and diversity, as well as maybe some non-correlated asset. They have a good amount of cash, you can see, and access to some joint assets here. If you include their brokerage account here, one might ask the question, why is this in Tim's name? That may not make sense. Why is that from an estate standpoint? Typically, we're finding a lot of people coming into retirement don't really care about wills. They haven't thought about it. And so I tend to look at this and say, gosh, there's a bunch of assets all over the place. Maybe we should think about consolidating or organizing this in some way, reducing the number of boxes. But in general, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for qualified, non-qualified, cash value or Roth. I'm looking for real estate and or annuities that have income capacity or pensions. And then I'm looking also for the advent of long-term care strategies, because we all know that if you don't have a strategy on this one, you're likely to be paying for it yourself. In other words, self-funding. Now, most people don't think about self-funding long-term care, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But the reality is that when we tend not to see long-term care on this kind of area here, we got to ask that question, is the plan to self-fund this? Now, you might notice, it turns out actually that this guy, Tim, has a life insurance policy with a rider, a long-term care rider. So he's got a good amount of life insurance. For those of you that are wondering what this is a survivorship policy that's held in their family trust because their son has special needs. In fact, you might notice that they're also really care about this autistic foundation. So when you have families who have cares for legacy issues, things that are beyond their current needs for spending, we can sometimes wrap the retirement planning and those needs to bubble up discussions around why we need to potentially have different types of insurances, maybe held in trusts for other parties, why we need to consider long-term care. So when I think about assets that do double duty, one of the things that products like this that we're seeing out there, which are life insurance with long-term care riders, is maybe there are ways for us to solve a couple problems. Another also common thing we're seeing is that people who purchased annuity features and are investing it as such might actually have some income benefits that we can rely upon from this. Whether you like that idea or not is not really the question here for this discussion. It's really to show that sometimes there are ways for us to do a couple different things with assets that might meet some needs here and to illustrate it in AssetMap that way. Okay, so I want to keep moving here. Some of the other things that I will share with you tend to do with now the planning side of it, right? Hopefully what you've taken from the asset map is you want to have a discussion about the intentionality of why everything is here in the map. Think of it like your basement or your closet or your garage. It doesn't always get the attention that it needs because it's not really urgent in an issue until all of a sudden you need it to use it. And there's a bunch of junk down there, some of it that's valuable, some of it that should have been donated years ago. I'm probably speaking for myself, but if you're anything like me and you kind of sometimes keep things that may have some sentimental or other value, sometimes you realize when you look at this stuff, it doesn't serve us. So the question you should be asking when you look at this is, how am I going to use this? How does this serve me? Is this usable? Does it make sense? And if it doesn't, we should look at replacing it or fixing it or filling it. So that's really the key. Have that conversation with clients, always thinking about when they arrive, do they have the right stuff? Okay. If you see huge accounts or serious overcommitments to a single asset class, like a business or like an IRA, you need to think about how am I going to want this to look in the future? And let's start building towards that. Now let's talk about retirement because the target maps that we've built into AssetMaps, are really, really flexible. But I wanted to frame this by making sure that we talked a little bit about some of the bigger issues in progress funding. If you've used target maps before or you're thinking about it, this is not an attempt to confuse financial planning. This is an attempt to answer the GPS question, which is, okay, where are we on the map? And are we on track to actually get to our destination on time? I need to know that in 30 seconds because my attention deficit is kicking in. And so the key is we have to know this. Instead of actually focusing on budgets and how much you're spending, we try to ask clients to buy into the idea that they're going to be spending, but it all comes down to how much and for how long. All right. And so the key we've found over the last 20 some years using this and other tools is that we know that all financial planning is going to be wrong as soon as we make it, right? Because our numbers are changing, our assumptions are wrong, and all this other fun stuff. Despite the accuracy we feel we put into this stuff to get these numbers right, we all know that it's a little bit hocus pocus. That being said, the key to planning long-term and funding is really actually a continuous recalculation so that we're getting feedback as to whether we're on track. And I think we got to communicate that to pre-retirees. The lines that we would typically say was, we're going to do this plan today. Based upon today's current condition, you are 90% funded for retirement. We're short. We need to save another $2,000 a month. But we all know that this is wrong, right? We agree. You're not going to arrive exactly on time. So the reason I need to stay with you is to stay engaged so that we can actually revisit this continuously. And that's what target maps are going to do. We'll show you that. Clearly, it all comes down to expected returns with our platform. We're not trying to model Monte Carlo. We're trying to say, what are your expectations of returns? And I'm going to show you actually how you handle deficits and surpluses literally in 4 minutes. And of course, one of the conversations that keeps coming up within our retirement planning is, how do we make the returns really irrelevant? And I'll show you actually how to do that. That might sound strange. How do you make returns irrelevant? Well, you have enough guaranteed income, and I'll show you how to do that. And I think one of the bigger questions for all of us in the industry, if you're giving some level of financial advice, is to recognize that we are actually helping people make short-term decisions, the decision right now, based upon long-term models, which is a little bit awkward, but it's the best we can do, right? In other words, I can only change what I know today. I can't fix the past. I can't predict the future. What are we going to do today about it? I'm going to show you how we tend to do this. Okay. So what I did is I created a retirement model for both Tim and Christine. And I actually created two models. One was a model where they basically retired. I'm going to show that to you. And one is if they have a long-term care event smack in the middle of it, because I wanted to really communicate to them how much it would cost to self-fund these plans. I'm going to look at the first one here. As we go into this, one of the things I'll point out to you is the key for AssetMap is really to address, I should say target maps, is really to do one thing, and that's just tell somebody what the current state is. You might notice that there is actually a summary statement here in the middle. If you're ever lost, just read that summary statement to somebody, and that tells you what this tells you. But the key for this was to try to basically communicate what kind of cash flow do you want to spend and what is it going to cost to fully self-fund that based upon an expected return on capital. So you might see here that I'm expecting that if I'm going to invest any money, I'm expecting that it should earn 5% on a net basis going forward. That's my threshold for me. I can change that, but this is typically where we start. And it would cost me about $2.5 million to fully fund this level of spending. You can see it here, $100,000 a year, inflated at 3% for age 65 to 100, and then medical expenses of additional $25,000 a year at age 75, right? Because we think we're going to be on the hook for that. What's amazing is that we need to communicate to pre-retirees how much net capital we're going to need to fully self-fund this. The numbers are big. And so when you tell somebody I need $2.5 million effectively in the bank to fund this, that's at least the target number for most people. What's interesting is that very few people can actually communicate well what the value of all the things they put into place. Certainly, if you've got an asset with 100 grand in it and there's no tax obligation, we know it's worth 100 grand. But if you've got a cash flow or some kind of income stream or certainty or a future asset that's going to be worth something maybe in the future, that's where people don't necessarily know how it plays into their whole kind of financial plan. And so what we've done here is we're actually valuing cash flows that are going to come in today and in the future. And we're also valuing assets and discounting them for the embedded tax to basically create an apples to apples approach to tell somebody how much of that self-funding do they have covered from other sources. The big takeaway, of course, from this specific map is that you should be looking effectively here is that they're short $384,000 in capital, or the equivalent of about $2,800 a month for the next 16 years, which is how long they have until this event occurs. And you could obviously tell somebody, listen, if we just inflate our savings, I can maybe turn off my pen. How about that? That would be nice. Turn off pen. You could do it. There you are. If I just inflate our savings, then effectively I can communicate that and say, listen, we only need to save $2,200 a month. Again, I'm already agreeing with you in your mind that says that these numbers are wrong. They're wrong because they're going to be wrong as soon as I print them. Because we're not going to arrive on time. We're not going to live to age 100. We're not going to spend everything perfectly. But the key is to provide certainty and what specifically we need to take action on for pre-retirees. Now, we run these continuously. These are constantly tracking live to goal for all clients that have these generated. So once I create it, it's set it and forget it. So that means once we're in the middle of retirement, it's still calculating what's left to retirement. Same thing is true for all the analysis. But here's what I want to communicate, and I've seen this come up as an issue for a couple of people, which is the changes of expectations of return tell something really interesting. I just increased the expected return on capital to 6% from now going forward to the end of this entire model. And now all of a sudden, instead of being short $2,200 a month, we actually have a surplus over the next 16 years for $600. What does that mean? Well, it means that long term, if we can achieve a higher rate of return by simply 1%, it means instead of actually having to save, they actually have more money to spend on other things. Well, like what, Adam? Well, they could actually use that money to start building an estate strategy, perhaps. Maybe they could put $600 a month towards a long-term care solution or a gifting strategy for their favorite charity, or maybe their kids' education, right? So one of the interesting things of trying to communicate why it's so important to manage expectations around return is because it really impacts the kind of lifestyle that you can have. And I care more about communicating that to clients than communicating what their actual portfolio is going to pretend return on a simulation basis going forward times 1,000 iterations. That is too obscure for most humans. But telling them they should set a standard that we're not going to make investments unless we know we can earn 4% long term. Now let's show me how we're going to do that. That's much more actually executable, believe it or not, in the actual space. So I just dropped this to 4% and it shows, oh my gosh, abysmal. I'm short $1 million. You're going to have to save almost $6,000 a month for the next 16 years. So clearly you can argue for people that they should start setting expectations of what we should be earning on these portfolios long term, of where they work and where they break. The other really actionable piece that we should be talking about in retirement, and I'm going to drop this back to 5 because, let's go the other direction. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Is on the right, you might notice that there's a cash flow tool now. We actually enabled this. We had a lot of people ask for, I need to see the burn downs. I need to understand where we run out of money and expand all these things. But here's kind of what's really interesting about this. These people actually have a capacity to save a significant amount of money. Turns out it was about $65,000 a year that they're putting into their portfolio. But one of the things that I tend to focus on these days is the following. Let me grab my pen tool. In the first early years of retirement, let's say when they turn 65, 66, probably the most certainty that I can have around pre-retirement is these first 5 years, okay? Now, granted, if I was only 2 years away from this, I would feel much more comfortable with these numbers. I'm using a model that's 20 years away, so you'll forgive me there and just use your what's the word I'm looking for? Imagination. That's it. The reason I wanted to share this with you is we're finding in a meeting with a client who's a year or two from retirement, one of the most important things to communicate is the idea of where the first 3 years of excess burn is going to come from. In this case, what I'm saying to the client is, I need to spend $126,000 of your portfolio assets to complement the other fixed income sources that I have coming in order to get you to your spend that you want to spend for the annual year. What's important about this is that typically we like to build buffers. And if you're using a bucket strategy or a buffer strategy, we tend to say we want 3 to 5 years of excess spending that I'm expected from my portfolio in something that's safe and secure so we can sit out markets like we're experiencing maybe right now. Right. So then I would need to have, and for all of our clients, we have at least 3 years of buffer. That means in this case, 126 plus 143 plus 136 in assets that they can't mess up, that the market is not going to intentionally just eradicate and force liquidation of other assets that might be down and I would take a loss on. And so what's really key about this whole model that we created for everybody is that the most valuable part in the field when you're talking to someone who's pre-retirement is getting them to agree to the idea that this is the kind of distribution we're going to need to make from that portfolio. Those are sometimes big numbers. If they're small and you have a person who has a lot of guaranteed income coming in from pensions, annuities, whatever they have, and you have to make small distributions, you could afford to keep that buffer number pretty small, and that means remain invested probably for a longer term period. But I want to kind of create the importance here of that when you're talking to clients and saying, what do I take away from this? What does this mean, this whole bunch of numbers? What it means is that these first bunch of years are probably my most certainty in terms of this application. I need to set aside almost $500,000 of assets and stuff that we can't mess up. The rest of it can remain invested. If you use an endowment model or some other kind of long-term cash flow model, this is a very effective way to do it. So I hope you understood that, because I know a lot of advisors are missing how to actually use this report. That's what we tend to communicate with the client. Despite the fact that it's valuable, we tend to discount most of these numbers because we all know they're a bit hocus pocus. The other thing I just wanted to leave you with before we talk about these last elements is we really should be running this more, right? What I did is I cloned this first retirement funding plan, and then I put in an extra expense here. And so what you can see here is I changed up this to, if you could read over here on the left, and if that's legible here, let me see if I can zoom in. I changed it up to basically focus on what we call go-go years, slow-go years, and the no-go years. And you can see they're spending less money in each of those, we'll call tranches. But then I put in a long-term care event, and I gave a vacation house too. Okay, and these are the ones that I think we're not seeing a lot of in terms of running in the field. Why is that important? Well, if you've ever lived through a long-term care experience in your family, then you know that it costs a lot to take care of your people. That means your family. And so the real cost of that is often not actually discussed. And so one of the things I want to share with you is the importance of showing a retirement both with an event or without it. This is an event, this is without a long-term care event. These people only need to save $1,700 a month. If they have a long-term care event, they need to save $5,400 a month. Why? Because they have to build up a sinking fund to cover the $500,000 spend. Unfortunately, we don't tend to communicate that with clients enough. This is a really effective way to make it real for people and say, show me on the asset map which asset I can liquidate in order to cover this. Can I use the 401k? Can I use the brokerage account? Can I blow out the house? Do I have to use the business? Do I have to liquidate the business? You do not want to be in a situation when you have forced liquidation because you don't have a plan. And I really kind of impress upon you how important it is to have that story up front and hold people accountable to those ideas. So with that, I'm going to jump back into our presentation here, and I'm going to kind of end before we go to Q&A with this idea of checklists. In the engagement process, which is what we focus on at AssetMap mostly, financial engagement, there's been a couple of really cool things that we've come up with the years that have been really effective, and most of them were scrappy inventions that we just needed to solve a problem. But now they've become used by thousands of advisors, and so we want to point attention to them because many of you don't know that they exist. There's two things we've been working on recently, what we call the 6 L's, or the financial fire drills. It's a checklist, which I'll show this to you right now. You get it by going to the reports, turning off your pen, and you go into the reports section, and you can send this to a client. This is effectively, here it is. You can send this PDF. You can even ask that they sign it. But it's a great way for us to force a conversation around, do we have a strategy for these 6 events that typically disrupt our financial well-being? And if you could read this, it basically says, right, do you have enough cash? What are we doing if we had a disability? If we lost a life, what are we going to do? If we have a long-term care, are we self-funding it? If we live too long, what are we going to do? And if we have a legal or a liability situation, or if we care about legacy, what are we going to do? Do we have the plans in effect? So I've always used this in every annual review meeting to close, to make sure that we have our seatbelts on. I think it's a great way to have a conversation with clients. Another really cool tool that we just built, it's in beta right now, is our beneficiary report. If you've taken the time to put in who the recipient of this asset would be, in other words, via beneficiary, you can actually now create a balance sheet and kill somebody off. So if we lost Christine, you might learn that some of her assets are going to the kids, some of them are going to the special needs trust. But what's probably more important is how much is actually unassigned, right? Income sources that actually we don't have clarity around who's getting these assets. And so what it does is it questions the intentionality of the current decisions. Again, going back to AssetMap, you might learn that basically a lot of the stuff that people have on their map is not intentional. It's just haphazard. It's what they've had forever. They haven't fixed it, and it's our opportunity to help them address it. This can be printed, and it could start a great conversation of just making sure, from a checklist perspective, that all our stuff is in the right place.